Hi, my name is Dean Smith, and in this podcast I want to delve into some rather strange Bible verses that led up to the worldwide flood found in the book of Genesis.
Welcome to a podcast by opentheword.org, where we discuss a bit of Bible, a bit of life, and a bit of politics.
It involves the passage where the sons of God married the daughters of man. Now, I want to discuss four main themes that are found in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. Number 1, who were the sons of God? Number 2, who were the Nephilim? Number 3, how God's role in the world changed. And fourthly, the often unnoticed second judgment. First, who were the sons of God? In Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, we read,
Now it came about, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose.
In this passage, we read that the sons of God found the daughters of men attractive and began to marry them. But notice how it says that they chose whoever they wanted. The sons of God were in control of what was happening. So, who were the sons of God? Now, there are two basic points of view. Well, there are actually several, but the others are just variants of these two basic opinions. The first is that the sons of God were actually fallen angels. Throughout the Old Testament, we see the phrase sons of God referring to angels. We see references to that in Job chapter 1, verse 6, and Job chapter 2, verse 1, where angels, referred to as the sons of God, met with God in a giant angelic assembly. And some of these angels married women. The second belief is that this refers to marriages between the godly line of Seth, the sons of God, with women from the ungodly line of Cain, which of course were the daughters of men. Cain, of course, is the son of Adam and Eve, who murdered his brother Abel, and Seth is a son born to Adam and Eve after Abel's death. There are pros and cons to each of these opinions. The con concerning angels is based on Mark chapter 12, verse 25, where Jesus said that the angels are not given in marriage. It's argued that since angels can't marry, how could this happen? The best counter to this argument is that it means angels are not allowed to marry, but this does not mean that they can't marry. It's similar to Roman Catholic priests who take vows of celibacy but are still quite capable of marrying someone, provided they're willing to break their vows. The argument against these being marriages between the godly line of Seth and the ungodly line of Cain is, why would these basically normal human marriages produce Nephilim or men of renown? Now, for years I believed that these marriages involved the descendants of Seth and Cain. But I changed my mind after I read a verse further down in Genesis chapter 6 that talked about why Noah was chosen to build the ark.
This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. Genesis 6, verse 9.
At the beginning of this verse, we are told that this is about the genealogy of Noah, which includes his ancestors. In this context, we are then told that Noah was perfect in his generations. Now, many versions read that Noah was perfect in his time, but it's often footnoted that the Hebrew word dor literally means generations. Now, this is an important change because time leaves the impression that Noah was perfect among the people living during his day. But if the word is generations, it is talking about the past and means Noah's lineage or his ancestors were perfect. The Hebrew word tamim, translated perfect, means just that. Perfect, whole, complete, having integrity. In other words, the verse is suggesting that Noah's ancestry was perfect or intact and seems to be referring to the purity of his lineage. Why is this important? Well, if the sons of God were angels, then their genetics were mixing in with the human population, producing this superior group of men. In this context, the verse is telling us that Noah's lineage had not been contaminated by angelic DNA. His lineage was intact. And because of this, the verse provides a very vital clue as to why God initiated the worldwide flood. Generally, we believe that God judged the world because it was full of wickedness and violence. But when God killed off all of humanity, sparing only Noah and his family, this means God was not judging the world because of its wickedness, but rather to reset and restore the human population back to its original Adam and Eve DNA. God used the flood to remove the angelic genetic contamination. If this is true, it also suggests that God must have done something to prevent those fallen angels from simply marrying women when the human race was restarted after the flood. This leads to the second obvious question. Why would these fallen angels want to marry human women? I believe the answer goes back to Genesis chapter 3. After Satan tempted Adam and Eve to fall into sin, God cursed Satan by stating that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent in verse 15. This means that one of Eve's descendants would deal a telling blow to Satan. Of course, that descendant was Jesus. So, was the marriage between these fallen angels and human women an attempt by the satanic realm to hijack and corrupt the human seed and basically remove this threat? I think it was. This leads me to my second point. Who in the world were the Nephilim? Now, if you go to YouTube, you can find dozens of theories on the Nephilim that they were a race of giants spawned by the marriage between fallen angels and humans. I mean, the word Nephilim is generally translated giants. But as I read this verse in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, I have a slightly different opinion on what was going on here.
The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown.
Two things stick out. First, we are told that the Nephilim lived at the same time as the marriages between the fallen angels and human women, and after. While many believe that the Nephilim were the results of the marriage, others, including myself, believe the verse suggests that the Nephilim were already around when the marriages were taking place. In other words, the Nephilim are not the offspring of these ungodly marriages. This means they are part of the human gene pool, and that is why the Bible says they existed after the flood in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. But the ungodly marriages between the fallen angels and daughters of men did produce children, and they are described as mighty or powerful. I don't believe this referred to just their physical strength, but I believe it described their mental abilities as well, and they became men of renown. Because of their superior abilities, they were leaders of society and people of influence. Before I go on, I want to briefly look at how another major turning point in biblical history, the Tower of Babel, when God broke up the world into different languages and cultures in Genesis chapter 11, is connected to what happened in Genesis chapter 6. But it is important for us to understand a couple of things about the Tower of Babel incident. After people were broken apart by language, different nations began to develop along with their own unique culture and history. But this also means that everything prior to the Tower of Babel is common history to all cultures. This is why cultures from the Sumerians to the Aborigines in Australia have ancient stories of a massive worldwide flood. They all share this common history. But what also shows up is ancient stories of kings who were half god and half men, such as the Sumerian king Gilgamesh. Now, it is possible that these stories are referring to the men of renown mentioned in Genesis that were the offspring of the marriages between the sons of God and the daughters of men. If these marriages involved fallen angels, from a human perspective, they would have a godlike aura about them, particularly if they produced special abilities in the children. Now, I'm not saying that Gilgamesh was one of these people of renown, but perhaps it was a story based on what happened during this time in human history. Now, let's briefly look at why God broke people apart through language. In the account, we are told,
Then they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Genesis 11, verse 4.
We are told that they wanted to build a tower that reached up to heaven because they wanted to make a name for themselves. But is there something more sinister going on here than just building a monument? Now, it may be just a coincidence, but the Hebrew word for make a name for themselves is the same Hebrew word used for men of renown in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, that describe the descendants of the angel human marriages. Now, in Genesis chapter 6, we read that it was the angels that initiated the marriages with women. But is the reverse happening here? Are we seeing men trying to initiate contact with angels so they could restart these marriages that led to the creation of people of renown? Obviously, it wouldn't have succeeded, but nevertheless, it revealed the intent of their heart, and God brought this to an end by dividing the people through language. Now, let's move on to the last 2 points of my podcast that are mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3.
Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years.
My third point is this. What does it mean when it says that God's spirit would no longer strive with men? The word strive does not fully portray the meaning of the Hebrew word din. According to the Theological Wordbook of the Old Testament, the Hebrew word din is used 23 times in the Old Testament and means to rule or govern. In each instance except here, it is specifically used in the context of governing, either in the sense of legislative, passing laws, judicial, enforcing laws, or executive, administering laws, as it's used in Genesis chapter 49, verse 16, and Proverbs chapter 31, verse 9. Consequently, we must conclude that the word has the same meaning in Genesis chapter 6:3. Instead of striving, it means God was no longer going to govern men. So what this tells us is that after Adam and Eve fell into sin, God was quite prepared to work with humans in their fallen state. God was going to continue to govern or rule people. And we see hints of this in a judicial sense when God dealt with Cain after he murdered Abel. But after the marriages between the fallen angels and human women, new powerful leadership emerged, and people no longer wanted God to govern humanity, so God withdrew. And I believe it was at this moment that Satan moved in to take over the world and became the lowercase god of this world. Satan did not take over the world when Adam and Eve fell into sin. It happened at this moment in human history. I know people love to ask, why does God allow pain, suffering, and disease in the world? This is what we wanted. We wanted a world free from God's rule, and we got it. The fourth thing I want to discuss is the second judgment that is embedded in Noah's flood account. It's almost unnoticeable, but has had a profound impact on humanity today. When God says man's days shall be 120 years, God had now reduced man's lifespan. Before the flood, humans were living hundreds of years. In Genesis 5, we read that Methuselah lived 969 years and Lamech 777 years as examples. But this was about to change, as 120 years was now the maximum lifespan. Now, depending on health, war, disease, famine, we often don't reach that age, but this is the max we could live. In his column entitled Odd Body, published in the National Post, Dr. Stephen Wan made this interesting statement.
Some cell biologists now believe there is a definite limit to human cell reproduction, making the maximum age possible for human life to be about 110 to 120 years.
Others, such as UK neurobiologist Professor Colin Blakemore, who has been knighted for his medical research, states that 120 years is, quote-unquote, the absolute limit to human lifespans. He was responding to some claiming that science would soon be able to extend human life. It's curious. This lifespan limit that was recorded in the Bible thousands of years ago is just now being picked up by science. Though the length of our lifespan changed after the flood, we don't immediately pick up on this because the age decline was gradual. If the first child after the flood died at the age of 120 years, we would have clicked on this immediately. After the flood, Abraham lived to 175 years of age, and it isn't until we reach Genesis 50 that records Joseph living to 110 that we no longer have anyone surpassing the 120-year lifespan. Now, I want to add this. The 120-year lifespan may even play a significant role in the end times. Many end-time scholars believe the restoration of Israel is a key signpost signaling Christ's imminent return, and believe Jesus would return within a generation of Israel's restoration in 1948. During the 70s and 80s, there were dozens of books being written talking about Christ's imminent return because people were suggesting a generation was 40 or 50 years. But what if a generation is 120 years? If so, it would put Christ's return sometime before 2068 AD, in other words, in our century. Now, I just want to close with this. There are many interpretations of the first 4 verses of Genesis 6. You may disagree with me, and that is completely fine. This is just my opinion.
Thanks again for joining us on our podcast. Please check out our website at opentheword.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to receive notifications of future broadcasts. As well, please take a moment to provide a rating and even a review. Thanks again for listening.